When you think of landscape photography, what do you think of first? When I think of it, I think about big, wide, open vistas, colorful skies and sunrises and sunsets. I think of the vastness of nature at its best. I absolutely adore landscape photography. There's nothing better than getting out there in nature and just trying to capture a single slice of it through photography. And while I'll be talking about landscape photography in the traditional sense, for me, I like to think of all scapes in the same category. Landscapes, cityscapes, seascapes, cloudscapes. Anything that has a subject and then a large vista is a scape to me. Now, in this video, we're going to be covering how to choose the right lenses for landscape photography, or any scapes for that matter, all of which is a very huge deal, because it is only through our lens choices that we're able to achieve some of the creative looks that you might commonly associate with landscape photography. But more on that in just a moment. Just as a quick reminder, as always, that if you want to skip all of the YouTube foraging for content and education, and you want to learn photography from end to end once and for all, then check out my Photography Fundamentals course, which I will leave a link to in the description below. All right, this video is going to be broken down into 4 sections. We're going to be talking about the most common lens for landscape photography, and then we have some very important distinctions we have to consider when making a purchase decision, and then how that affects aperture. And then we'll also talk about zooms and primes very quickly, and then we will finish off the video with some personal recommendations as always. Before I tell you the most common lens for landscape photography, keep in mind that with landscape photography, or any genre of photography really, there is no hard and fast or right or wrong answer for any of this stuff. The gear that you have right now could be the best gear for you. So don't feel compelled to rush out there and buy the latest and greatest thing. While some lenses do provide opportunities for specific creative looks more so than others, you can shoot a landscape image at almost any focal length. For most intents and purposes, the only limiting factor is your creativity and your imagination. That being said, the most common lens for landscape photography does have a very specific creative look that is very difficult to replicate at any other focal range. And this magic lens and this magic focal range is, you might have guessed it, the 16 to 35 focal range. The 16-35 is the bread and butter of a landscape photographer's toolkit. And in fact, the general sentiment of this ultra wide focal range, whether that be 10 millimeters or 12 to 24 millimeters or 16-35 millimeters, is that the wider the focal length, the more of the landscape we're able to capture. Most of the time when we're out capturing landscapes, they are usually quite large, right? Usually quite a bit wider than even our own field of vision. And we most likely will have to turn our heads to get visibility over the entire scene. But using a 16-35 will enable us to really capture the scale and the vastness and the grandness of that scene in a much easier way. Take this image as an example. This is an image that I shot in the Dolomites in Italy, a place that is widely known for its amazing, gigantic rock formations and vistas that are larger than life. This is a 16mm image taken handheld, but I will overlay some drone footage of the surrounds here so that you can see for yourself just how gigantic this place is and just how much landscape there is to capture. This 16mm focal length in this image is only just enough to capture this particular composition in this particular way. Now, with the 16-35, it is a zoom, and in landscape photography, it is extremely convenient to have a range of focal lengths that we can play with, because sometimes when you're at a location, you don't have a lot of physical room to move around in. Sometimes there are locations where you're in a sketchy position or you just can't walk around for some reason. So it's really important and really useful to be able to play with different focal lengths. This is an example of a punched in version of that image, which is shot at 35 millimeters, standing in exactly the same spot. And there are so many examples of this where it is nice to be able to change up your compositions while remaining in the same location. Now, as it pertains to a buying decision for 1635s, we've got some important decisions and distinctions to make here. Most of the major camera brands will have a f2.8 version and an f4 version of their 1635, 2470, and 7200, or what is commonly known as the Holy Trinity. Now, especially for you new photographers, you probably won't know this right off the bat, but a 1635 isn't a 1635 isn't a 1635. Sure, the f2.8 and f4 versions share the same focal range and will look very similar in terms of their overall composition. But as you would have probably guessed, for those people who want to spend a little bit more money on a higher quality item, of course, the camera brands have you sorted. The f2.8 versions of these lenses are usually the pro versions or the pro level versions of these lenses. And these lenses have a wider aperture, which allows for one stop more of light than the f4 version. They also have, usually nice things like weather sealing and clickable aperture rings and custom buttons and all of that jazz. And they are also usually sharper and usually more detailed than their f4 counterparts as well. However, the downside is that they are usually far more expensive. Like we're talking thousands of dollars here, and they're also usually heavier and also usually physically bigger than their f4 counterparts. Now, the f4 versions of these lenses, however, usually have decent image quality. Not the best, but definitely better than your typical kit lens or beginner lenses, and most of the time, they're more than sharp for most people. They're usually also quite small and quite portable. They're light, usually pretty easy to use, but of course don't have the same bells and whistles of the f2.8 versions, but they are most certainly cheaper. As an example, here is the Sony 1635 f2.8 G Master 2, and this is the Sony 1635 f4G. This is an f2.8, this is an f4. The f2.8 weighs 583 grams, while the f4 weighs 386 grams. And as you can see, one is physically larger in both height and in width than the other. Now, how you decide to purchase one versus another is definitely a matter of budget, first and foremost. So look up the respective prices in your own country and then decide from there. However, I do have a recommendation that might swing the balance, which we will talk about in the aperture and recommendation sections of the video coming up shortly. Now, before we dive into aperture, I wanted to quickly talk about another very common lens that most landscape photographers use, and that is the 70-200. Now, you might not think that this big old thing is a landscape photographer's sidekick and second best friend, but it most certainly is. Now, remember in some cases when we're out in the world taking photos of scapes, we often don't get that much of an opportunity to move around. What the 70-200 allows us to do then is the ability to punch into the details of our scenes that we might not have been able to do so by cropping in when we're using, say, a 16-35. Take this next little series of images as an example. On my trip to Antarctica, of course, you are stuck on a boat for very much of the time with very little opportunity to move around very much. However, with the 70-200 and occasionally the 2X extender, I was able to punch in on the details that were very, very far away and create images of the landscapes and the nature there that I was super happy with, even though I wasn't close to the subjects at all. This just isn't possible with any normal lenses and is most certainly the creative strength of a telephoto lens like this. Okay, if you're enjoying this video so far, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button for me so that I know it's good enough to make even more free videos just like this in the future. Okay, something I wanted to cover is the issue of aperture. Not only in deciding what kind of lens to purchase, but also in what kinds of aperture you could be using when you're out there capturing escapes. Here's the thing, without going into too much detail, because it really warrants its own entire video, and because I've covered it extensively in my photography fundamentals course already, when you are shooting landscapes, usually they are quite far away. Most of the time, that means that your hyperfocal distance, or the distance after which elements will move into an acceptable amount of focus, that is quite large in landscape photography. Most of the time, when you're shooting scapes, most things are mostly going to be in focus most of the time, even at a really large aperture such as f2.8. For example, at f2.8, your hyperfocal near limit, which is the closest point to which elements become acceptably sharp, is a mere 1.53 meters away when you're shooting at 16 millimeters. Meaning that if you're shooting at 16 millimeters using f2.8, everything from 1.5 meters away from there is going to be in focus. At f4, that distance comes down to 1.08 meters at 16 millimeters, literally less than the distance between me and the camera right now. So when you're shooting landscapes, chances are your subjects are going to be mountains or other things that are super far away from you. So most of the time, those things are going to be more than 1.5 meters away from you. At the other extreme end, at 200 millimeters, at f2.8, the hyperfocal near limit is 237 meters away. At f4, that comes down to 168 meters away. And again, if you're shooting landscapes, most of the time when you're picking out details in your scenes, they're going to be further away than that. Okay, why did I just toss out that super complex mumbo jumbo at you? Well, it's basically to say that when it comes to deciding between f2.8 and f4 lenses, you know, whether that is 1635, 2470, 7200, or otherwise, shallow depth of field isn't really a thing. Bokeh isn't really a thing. They're not usually creative decisions to care about, unlike in, say, portrait photography. Most of the time, when it comes to landscape photography, there's less of a creative restriction when it comes to how the image looks in regards to what is in focus. Because our subjects are so far away, whether you're shooting at f2.8, f4, f8, f11, whatever, most of the time, it's going to look similar. And this can save you a ton of money when it comes to deciding which lenses to get, which we will talk about more in the recommendations section. But advanced techniques like focus stacking aside, whenever I'm shooting landscapes, I'm typically changing my aperture to wherever the lens is actually the most sharp. Usually for modern Sony lenses, at least, that is around f5.6. No hyperfocal considerations, no shallow depth of field considerations, just whatever is going to get me the highest quality image. Maybe other people might disagree based on their own nuances and, situations, but that for me is most certainly what I shoot like and what I recommend as well. When it comes to zooms versus primes, well, if you've been following well enough, you've probably come to the conclusion that for most situations, zooms and the flexibility they provide are usually the option when it comes to most landscape photographers. Primes are nice for the size and the weight savings, especially if you have to, say, hike somewhere to get a shot or something like that. But oftentimes, as I mentioned in the previous section about aperture, the faster speeds of those primes aren't really going to give you any performance benefit. That being said, oftentimes as photographers, we're not just landscape photographers, and I've taken many a portrait on a landscape mission. So the flexibility in that respect is also very important. All right, what are my personal recommendations for lenses when it comes to scapes? Well, for most people, I would recommend the Holy Trinity at f4. That is the 1635, 2470, and 7200, all at f4. This will give you not only the most amount of flexibility to shoot between 16 and 200, but it will also save your wallet and save your back from owning the heavier pro versions of those lenses. If you are optimizing for scapes specifically, I would optimize it to go 16-35 first, then 7200, then 24-70 last. Out of all of those, if there was one lens that I would consider upgrading to f2.8 first, in general, that would most likely be the 24-70 because you can shoot literally any genre of photography with that lens, and it would be a great base to allow you to then shoot scapes as well and to then experiment with other genres and different styles. From there, if you see yourself doing nighttime or low light photography more often in a landscape context, then the 16-35 f2.8 is great for that. And then finally, the pro version of the 7200 will get you some amazing bokeh if your shots are compressed, although that is a little bit more of an advanced topic for another time. In terms of what I personally use, while I own both the f2.8 and the f4 versions of the 16-35, I actually use the f4 version slightly more often because it's lighter and the image quality is still amazing. I'll only really ever use the f2.8 version if I'm shooting something important like a campaign or something like that, and I absolutely need the top of the line image quality. I'll also use the 7200 f2.8 only because the GM Mark II version has come down in weight substantially, so I don't mind bringing it along. And usually I will have these two lenses and two bodies so that I don't have to switch all that often. Alrighty, I hope that helped. And if you are a little bit more of an experienced photographer watching this, then comment down below what you're using so that you can help out your fellow newbie photographers. All right, I hope you enjoyed that video. And again, if you want to fast track your photography learning, then check out my photography fundamentals course over at patk.com/accelerate. And I will see you in the next video. But until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.